Hello everybody, and welcome to my story summary of Legacy of Kain, Blood Omen 2. This is the fourth game in the series. I will start off by saying that this game is probably the weak link in terms of the whole story of Legacy of Kain, but there is an important aspect of it, which is Janos Audrin's involvement, which he will make an appearance, spoilers. The events of this game take place after those in the first Blood Omen after Kain refused the sacrifice, and shows how history had been altered by Kain preventing Raziel's soul from entering the Reaver at the end of Soul Reaver 2. There are a couple of outright mistakes made within the story. One of them being the fact that all of the vampires in this world would be Kain's offspring, considering he would be the final remaining vampire, and they don't ever really address that or behave as such. But it's certainly true of all of them except Janos. And there is a greater, more specific mistake revolving around that we'll get to later. This one's got a little cutscene in the title, so we'll start there. Let's go and get into it. We see Kain kind of passed out and dreaming about the fall of the pillars after his refusal of the sacrifice. We're then shown the beginnings of Kain's campaign against Nosgoth in order to control it, but it seems to hit a snag soon after it hits the city of Meridian. We see that a force led by some creature that we can already kind of tell isn't really human, defeats Kain and takes the Soul Reaver for himself. There's also a little opening text, which I'll show here for a bit. We then see Kain wake up in a bit of a daze, and right away he meets the vampire Uma, who says she and some of her friends found him near death and rescued him. She tells him that they're still in Meridian, and that Kain has been asleep recovering for 200 years. She goes on to tell Kain that his army was defeated by a new iteration of the Seraphan, who have taken up the same name and cause to eradicate vampires as the Seraphan in old history. Their leader is known as the Seraphan Lord, who uses magic that vampires find alien, and apparently, through promises of destroying vampires, has gained control of all of Nosgoth. She then goes on to say that she belongs to a faction known as the Cabal, who are apparently the final vampires that are resisting Seraphan rule. She says the Cabal are struggling because the glyph magic the Seraphan use detects vampires very easily. She wants Kain to help, and says he can do so mostly because he is no longer recognized by the Seraphan. We also learn later that Kain still uses his Beguile ability passively to look human, and these things helping to act covertly can greatly help the Cabal. Now Kain doesn't really need a lot of extra incentive to go after the Seraphan, but he doesn't really trust the Cabal, and he says he doesn't want to play the pawn again. Kain tells Uma that he's ready to confront the Seraphan Lord right now, but Uma says it's too early for several reasons, such as several traitor vampires defending the Seraphan Lord, hoping to preserve their own lives, but also Kain is in a weakened state after his long rest. Uma starts taking Kain somewhere he can feed, and talks to him in his head along the way via a whisper ability that vampires seem to have, because it just wouldn't be Blood Omen without disembodied voices. She leads him to a human in shackles, who Kain feeds on, because it just wouldn't be Blood Omen without random humans in shackles, and in fact because of the game mechanics, you as the player are kind of encouraged to kill everybody you see along the way, including villagers that are just minding their own business. So it's very possible that that's exactly what Kain does. At this point, we're kind of getting the tutorial and rundown of what it means to be a vampire, but if I need to tell you things like how they feel about water, then you're watching the wrong video. Kain soon comes across this translucent green wall, and Uma explains that it's a barrier that's powered by Seraphan glyph magic. It's made specifically to ward against vampires, and it burns them like fire upon contact. We also see that glyph magic powers machinery kind of like electricity, and that machinery is maintained by people known as glyphrites, who tend to keep to themselves and have a bad habit of vanishing into thin air. As we go along through the story, I'll note the various returning vampiric abilities that Kain uses throughout the story, especially if they're particularly relevant. For now, for the most part, he just uses Mistform for stealth. After a time, Uma tells Kain that she's going to introduce him to the leader of the Cabal, but soon after they get separated, and she tells him to meet a contact in the slums and be directed from there. Kain soon meets the contact, who's human, so we get the understanding that there are humans who are working for vampires knowingly and oppose the Seraphan, some of them in the hopes of becoming vampires themselves. This human directs Kain towards a place known as the Smuggler's Den, and is promptly killed by a mystery vampire as soon as Kain turns his back. When Kain gets to the Smuggler's Den, a section of the city which is pretty much what it sounds like, Uma whispers him, telling him to meet another contact in the tavern, and from there that contact will lead him to the Smuggler's Tunnel. He then meets that contact, who tells him there's a lift beyond the church that leads straight to that tunnel. Kain finds the tunnel without issue, and moving through it we find the mystery vampire that killed the human from earlier. Kain recognizes him as Faustus, a legionnaire who previously served under him, but now he seems to serve the Seraphan. Faustus informs Kain that the Seraphan Lord is aware that Kain is alive, and says things like he doesn't care about other vampires and is happy with the protection that he has. They have a good old fight, and Kain gives him a beatdown, and then drinks his blood. The process might look like this because Kain is reclaiming his vampiric powers, I'm not sure. In this particular case, Kain is now able to jump better. Moving on, Kain meets up with Uma again, who tells him about another string of people that he needs to talk to, starting with the tapster at the Red Raven pub. Kain gives a bit of guff about all this runaround just to meet the Cabal leader, and who's to blame him because there's still a bit, but he goes on anyway. Going to the pub, the tapster doesn't even work for the Cabal, she was just threatened to deliver a message, which is to visit a vendor near the warehouses, and how to get to him. He finds this vendor, who does work for the Cabal, and tells Kain that they are stationed beneath the Blue Lady shop. This area is to the east, however, and is pretty heavily guarded. Kain needs to pass through a Seraphan outpost, and in doing so we get to see an example of how they detect vampires. We see that a few of the Seraphan soldiers are outfitted with armor that glows in the presence of vampires, although there might be a little more to this detection than just glowing. There's not much said about it verbally. Also along this little jaunt of Kain's, he comes across another vampire who's currently in the middle of hunting and makes quite a mess. Kain doesn't currently recognize this vampire, who runs off, and Kain gives chase. We catch up to the vampire briefly to exchange words, who says he is indeed Kain's enemy, but he does not confirm whether or not he works with the Seraphan, although he does. And he then runs off once again. After this, Kain finds the shop, Blue Lady Curios, and finds the Cabal finally hanging out right downstairs. This is where the major story mistake comes into play, as the leader of the Cabal is apparently Vorador. Now, Vorador is definitely supposed to be dead after the events of the first Blood Omen, and nothing that has changed history up to this point has changed that, which is confirmed in the following title. Because of this, we'll think of Vorador as a different vampire completely, and we'll call him Frank. Now apparently, Frank did most of the work raising Kain's army before his defeat. Frank says it takes a lot of time and energy to raise vampires, which is part of why they're dwindling. Now we never really go into the process of raising vampires in the series as a whole, we just know it has something to do with reclaiming lost souls after death. Now all of this discussion about their numbers is in regards to an upcoming plan to attack the Seraphan Lord. But during all this planning, a vampire scout comes in badly injured to say that Uma has been captured after she has found some very important information and is soon to be executed by the Seraphan. Frank then requests that Kain go rescue Uma, expressing a need for his ability to blend in among humans via his Beguile ability. He tells Kain that the Bishop of Meridian, of what faith I'm not sure, is allied with the Cabal, and will help him find a secret entrance to the keep where Uma is held. Kain agrees to go, but he's more interested in Uma's information than her life. He goes to the upper city of Meridian and encounters yet another new vampire. This one Kain recognizes as Marcus, another lieutenant turned traitor. Apparently during the initial battle with the Seraphan, Kain turned on Marcus, or maybe vice versa. Either way, Kain tried to kill Marcus at that time and failed. We learn that Marcus has developed mind control powers similar to those that Kain used in the first Blood Omen. In fact, that's probably why he has them, having been passed down by Kain. He tries using them on Kain to no effect, and Kain says this is because Marcus has been practicing on dull mortal fools with minds full of commerce and dung. I like that quote. Marcus, however, still learns from Kain that he's seeking the Bishop of Meridian, and rushes off to find him first. Kain gives chase, but between Marcus warning soldiers ahead of time and a curfew being in place, his Beguile ability is not so useful anymore. Not that it really matters. Along the way, Kain encounters some random guy, who informs Kain that the Seraphan have already confronted the Bishop about his dealings with the Cabal, and they're currently gathering evidence on the matter, as if the stakes needed to be raised a little bit. In spite of all this, Kain does manage to find the Bishop alive. Marcus, however, is there as well, keeping the Bishop from speaking and threatens to kill him. Kain, of course, has no regard for the life of a mortal and just charges, and Marcus runs off. Kain chases Marcus around the area until they fall inside the cathedral, where they actually start fighting. One thing to note about this fight is Kain uses the sound of the church bells to stun Marcus. This seems to be the beginnings of a vulnerability in vampires that humans learn to exploit later in history, by building what will become the Silence Cathedral. Kain, of course, wins the fight, and reclaims his power, blood, whatever, and regains some of his mind control ability. And of course, as luck would have it, Marcus failed to carry out his threat, and the Bishop comes up to Kain alive, thanks him, and then personally escorts him to the Seraphan Keep. Kain now moved on in an effort to find Uma, and if anybody's disembodied voice chimed in at this point, They certainly didn't provide any relevant information, and probably weren't very relevant themselves. We get inside the keep and we see that several murals of Kain's defeat have been made, but Kain probably sees to it they don't survive the centuries. Further in, Kain finds his way blocked, but another agent of the Cabal happens to be there and says she can open the way. She refuses to do so, however, until a nearby nobleman who is visiting the keep has been killed. Kain begrudgingly agrees to do so, kills him, and moves on. Kain ends up finding the cell where Uma is being held, but she refuses to give the information she has until she's been freed. Kain of course does so, and soon after the Seraphan Lord appears wielding the Soul Reaver. The Seraphan Lord and Kain sling insults at each other, and of course Kain wants to fight right away, but Uma poofs them out of there, back to Sanctuary, before any real fighting can happen. Upon their return, Uma tells Fred that the Seraphan have a portal to somewhere unknown within the main foundry of the Industrial Quarter. She says this portal seems to be held open by something they know of called the Nexus Stone. They explain to Kain that the Nexus Stone does a few things such as opening portals, but it's also designed to protect those who wear it from the Soul Reaver. Naturally, this is what the Seraphan Lord used to defeat Kain in the battle centuries ago. The stone would of course be very helpful in the fight against the Seraphan, however the Cabal apparently have been unable to claim it. Kain confidently takes up this task and heads off to the Industrial Quarter. He pretty easily busts through this section of the city and takes a tram to the foundry. Once inside, Kain finds the Nexus Stone and also that vampire that ran off that one time. This time Kain recognizes him as another traitor, Sebastian. Sebastian had apparently arranged the ambush that had defeated Kain 200 years before. The two of them fight, Sebastian hoping to use some steam vents to his advantage, but this backfires. Upon his defeat, Sebastian tells Kain that this portal that's apparently there but we never see, leads to a device beneath Meridian that supposedly will lead to the victory of the Seraphan. Kain then does the thing which gives him better non-story fightitude. He then claims the load-bearing Nexus Stone, which causes the foundry to begin to explode. He attempts to escape the explosion, but then finds himself waking up back in Sanctuary, supposedly rescued by one of the Cabal. Kain then asks Ted about the device which Sebastian spoke of, and Ted knows nothing about it himself, but he speaks of an oracle who may know more about it. This oracle apparently lives just outside of Meridian, so Kain is off once more. The roads outside the city are pretty heavily guarded, and they're also plagued by demon-looking things whose origins aren't quite yet clear, but they are quite mean. After some time traveling, Kain encounters the house of the oracle, goes inside, and she recognizes him right away. It's rather obvious she's neither human nor vampire, and she says the device has been beneath Meridian since ancient times. She has Kain drink her blood to reawaken his telekinetic abilities, which he'll need to navigate the device. Just then, the Seraphan Lord attacks, and the oracle transports Kain straight to the entrance of the device as her home is razed to the ground. I will also note here that the oracle is betraying her people, but it's never really explained why. Upon entering the structure housing the device, Kain encounters a large creature who, unsurprisingly, knows who Kain is, and expresses that he's friendly. He explains that the Seraphan had imprisoned him here in order to use him to fuel the device. The creature tells Kain to seek the builder of the device, and goes on to tell Kain about an eternal prison that lies to the north. Apparently time doesn't really matter there. The creature says the builder is there. Ah, ah. There also just so happens to be a tunnel that leads straight from this room to the eternal prison. And the creature assures Kain that the builder will be willing to help destroy the device, so Kain takes the tunnel to the prison. Kain, now suddenly at his destination, walks right into the prison and encounters some kind of guard or something who tells him to leave. Kain of course ignores this repeatedly. These guys are actually almost polite in that they ask Kain to leave several times before finally resorting to attacking him. Along the way, we run into a messed up vampire who's enraged and running around the prison because his very specific dietary requirements for the day were not met. In his rampage, this vampire attacks Kain, who runs off and manages to submerge him in some water. In fact, this vampire chases and is submerged by Kain several times, which leads me to believe that these water currents all flow somewhere relatively dry. Deep in the prison, Kain finds the builder and gives him a classic warm Kain greeting. The builder readily explains the function of the device, which is essentially to kill all living things which aren't a member of the species to which the device is attuned. It was however unfinished, and the Seraphan Lord is using that creature and the glyph magic to create a network beneath Meridian in an attempt to boot it up and kill all vampires and humans in Nosgoth. The builder then says that his blood can be used to poison the mass at the center of the device, which is not to be mistaken with the creature we've already met, so Kain can drink his blood to later use. He's asking for death anyway, so Kain happily drains him dry. On his way out, Kain encounters the crazy vampire one more time, and they actually have a fight. Kain ends up beating him down with a giant statue of Mobius, which is rather significant in that one of the guards previously mentioned that this place was an experiment, and now we know whose. Regardless, this vampire comes to his senses and is revealed to be Magnus, another former lieutenant of Kain's. Unlike the others, however, Magnus says he's still loyal to Kain. Apparently somewhere along the line, the Seraphan Lord captured Magnus, messed with his mind, and sent him to this prison. Magnus also asks for death. Apparently people really don't like it here. So Kain does the maybe blood drink thing one last time, which helps him more easily kill things, and returns to the creature. Upon doing so, it begins to explain to Kain the nature of its captors and the Seraphan Lord. It's finally revealed that they are in fact the Hilden, mentioned at the end of Soul Reaver 2, and they are currently pulling the strings of the Seraphan. Now knowing this and ready to destroy the mass, Kain moves deeper into the device. Kain encounters and kills many Hilden down here, who also seem to be doing many experiments on humans. It also seems that these experiments lead to the creation of those creatures that we found on the road just outside of Meridian. Kain moves past these inconveniences and finds the mass, which he successfully poisons with his blood. When Kain returns to the creature powering the device, it has reconstituted its original form, revealing itself to be Janos Audron. It might be worth to note here that Janos' devolved form when he was weakened is not too dissimilar from the forms of Raziel's brothers in the late Nosgoth era. Also, while this is the first and possibly only time Kain and Janos meet each other, due to their places in prophecy and history, they're equally legendary to each other and already know of each other. Kain does question how Janos lives after having his heart ripped out, and while he doesn't explain why, there is a reason, which directly connects to the warning Kain gave to Raziel at the end of Soul Reaver 2. Janos then gives Kain a quick history lesson about the ancient vampires and their enemy the Hilden, and that the vampires banished them to another plane of existence. Janos says the Hilden circumvented their banishment when one of them broke through, which is also related to him still being alive. Don't worry, we see the whole thing play out another time. He goes on to say that this Hilden, who was the Seraphan Lord, had the opportunity to break through when Kain refused the sacrifice, dooming the pillars. Once within Nosgoth, the Seraphan Lord constructed a Hilden gate through which other Hilden could enter. Janos then explains that all the Hilden in Nosgoth are tied to this gate, including the Seraphan Lord himself. And so because the banishment is still at least partially in place, if this gate were to be destroyed, all the Hilden within Nosgoth would be killed. So Kain and Janos poof back to Sanctuary so they can begin planning for destroying the gate. So essentially their plan is to just send Kain by himself. The Hilden Gate is located in a city across the sea, which is protected by a shield which apparently prevents vampires from transporting in. Kain's job is to find and commandeer a transport headed towards the city, bust through the city as he's so good at doing, and disable the shield. Uma offers to accompany Kain, and while she does, Kain's not comfortable with it. As soon as they arrive at the wharves where they expect to find a transport, Uma snatches the Nexus Stone from Kain, not trusting his ambition for power. She then runs off, thinking that she can defeat the Seraphan Lord herself. Before too long, Kain catches up with her after she has a bad run-in with some Seraphan, and disappointed in her, he kills her, and takes back the Nexus Stone. Kain then manages to find a transport vessel, kills the crew, and sets it on its course. When he arrives at the Hilden City, he very gracefully docks the ship and disembarks. At this time, the Seraphan Lord pops in to greet Kain. Kain brags about having destroyed the device and having the Nexus Stone, but the Seraphan Lord expresses that he's still confident in the army which he's amassed, and leaves. Inside the city, Kain finds some rather helpful humans who are part of a surprisingly unimportant society who are being subjugated by the Hilden. They help Kain get a layout of the city, after which Kain works his way through. He eventually finds the shield generator and destroys it successfully. Afterwards, Janos and Ned show up, and Ned and Kain argue over Uma's death. They all then kind of get meaninglessly ambushed by the Seraphan Lord, who vanishes about as quickly as he appeared. Janos then tells Kain that the only way to destroy the portal is by throwing the Nexus Stone into it, and then uses his fancy teleportation magic to bring Kain straight to the building where it's located. It's here that Kain has the confrontation with the Seraphan Lord he's been looking for, during which it's fairly soon that he throws the Nexus Stone into the portal, sacrificing his defense against the Reaver. But it soon becomes fairly clear that the Reaver was not made for the Seraphan Lord, as Kain manages to disarm him just as Janos pops in. The Seraphan Lord and Janos begin to argue about the ancient war between their two species, with no real revelation about who actually started it. They get into kind of a fight, and the Seraphan Lord seems to have the advantage. Janos then expresses the importance of the Reaver over his own life and urges Kain to seize it. It's then that Janos is thrown into the portal, banishing him to the other plane of existence where the Hilden have been kept all this time. Now in terms of Janos Audron's personal timeline, this is the last we see of him, and we never find out what actually becomes of him. With the Soul Reaver in hand and the portal collapsing around them, Kain gives the Seraphan Lord a final beatdown. Once defeated, he reveals that the plane of existence to which the Hilden had been banished offers a kind of immortality, almost as if to mirror the curse of immortality placed upon the vampires. The portal collapses, the Hilden all kind of dissolve, and Kain moves on to build his empire as he normally planned. And that brings Blood Omen 2 to a close with one final chapter to go.
No, I had been set step by step upon the path that led to this outcome.